now, I think it should be evident to all of us that being resilient actually provides a competitive advantage, right? But at the same time, just as much as you can't educate children in the middle of a fight, you cannot build resilience in the middle of a crisis, right?
So I think the first thing is recognizing there's no clear line. You will not wake up one morning and say, whew, crisis is over. Now I'm in the new world and I'm going to operate this way. So what do you do with that? Recognizing that this is a continuum and an evolution. One thing that we have found is having a team who is focused on the crisis side of it, on the continuously monitoring how the world is changing and making sure that you're responding to that. Having folks that are distinct from the team that are thinking about the strategic impacts and how you can innovate and how you can adapt to the change in order to be more competitive, both in the crisis and beyond. That is very, very helpful, because when you ask the same people to do both jobs, what you will inevitably find is they always stay in the crisis management mode. There is always firefighting to do, and they will not often have that bandwidth in the heat of the moment to think about the strategic.
Our experience was we had to be very intentional, meaning I mentioned our operating rhythm, the rhythm in which we did certain things. We also had to be very intentional with building the digital backbone that we didn't have before and how we would use it, teaching people and setting rules for that. And that became important. Then we did some things which I didn't expect to do, and that was things like exchanges between different parts of my organization. For 4 months at a time, we would take a stand and send them to Kristen's organization, and Nick and send them another. And the idea was you socialize relationships, and those are individual relationships initially, but they become organizational sinew that connects and builds credibility. So you know somebody in that part of the organization to contact when the need arises. So we did a bunch of things which built the muscle.
You do have to then stop this crisis mode and start to think ahead. And we were fortunate in that we started to look very closely at our contingency planning about 2 years ago. And that was more in the expectation of a different sort of crisis, an economic crisis coming down the road. And that served us really well when we came into this situation. We were well prepared with those plans, and we'd involved, I think, the right people across the organization in preparing and the right territories. So that was somewhat lucky, and it was somewhat prescient, I guess, in terms of what could come in terms of crisis. Also, as a firm, and I think globally, we'd invested a lot in technology, and we'd also started upskilling our people digitally, and that was really, really important for us. When, from one day to the next, we put 14,000 people in CEE into a remote working scenario. That was really important for us to have made those investments up front, maybe for a different purpose, but they were really, really relevant when it came to this. But I think the thing going back, really to the people part of this, what probably helped us the most was recognizing that our people were desperate to know what this meant for them, right? How this was going to impact them, what was expected of them, how they were going to survive, right? And so we set out some very simple messages for our people up front, which is that, our priorities were to keep our people and our clients safe and informed, right? And that was the very first and most important aspect of that. Secondly, and I think this was really important for our people as well, is that we were going to do everything to protect their employment, right? So there was a massive concern, as you can imagine, over a year ago. Now we know that the crisis has impacted different businesses differently and more deeply, but there was a lot of concern. So I think to address those basic needs of our people in terms of communication was really important. And we looked to the previous crisis and we said we wanted to make sure that our business remained resilient and robust, so that when the crisis was over, we would come out of this very carefully. So I think that served us well, those very simple lessons. And one of the other things, I think, if you think about learning from that, the level of communication, our ability to connect with people, albeit remotely, was important, but it was also extremely important to be honest with them, right? And I think not to pretend that we had the answers to everything, not to pretend that we knew the outcomes, but to be very clear that we knew what we would do in response to events as they evolved. And I think that really helped our people in terms of giving them a level of stability and dealing with some of the real concerns that they had, and that served us really well.
One of the key themes that I hear from all three of you is that people are more important than technology, right? And it seems evident that organizations today need to move away from the classical hierarchical structure, the command and control structure, into a more adaptable, more flexible structure. But many of our organizations are actually built in a way that they are very much reliant on hierarchy. There's a lack of trust sometimes.
I think one of the first things understanding about people is they vary, that's self-evident, but they vary in experience and age. If you're a very young person, this is likely your first crisis. And to Nick's point, you're not sure you're going to survive your first crisis. You think you're going to either get sick and die, or you're going to lose your job, or something horrific. And yet some of us who are older, who have seen other crises, know that we're likely going to come through it. And so one of the first things we can do to people is say, I don't know how we're going to come through it, but we are going to come through it. We're going to make the necessary adaptations as we learn from that. And as we build in our young people, one of the ways to do that is to try to, I call it manufacture experience. Some things can be as simple as shared physical things that they do together. When times are good and there's no crisis, we take part of the people of my company rock climbing or things like that. And it's not dangerous, but it's just hard enough where they come through feeling good about themselves and good about being part of that team, and understanding that you're going to do very different things. We can't tell you exactly what your job's going to be next week because we don't know what the requirement's going to be. So you can't get perfect at it. What you can get perfect at is being ready to do what's needed.
One of the most surprising results from our first global crisis survey was the positive feelings that leaders reported after coming through a crisis. It really, and I think we've all experienced this in our own lives, coming together with a group of other people and going through something really challenging. Stan, you mentioned, you'd wish you'd been able to go whitewater rafting in advance of a crisis. But what we find is that, companies and colleagues really gel as teams once they've been through something like this. When you do crisis simulations, when you do tabletop exercises, when you do drills, you can create some of those feelings of that cohesiveness, of that team building, even though it's not a real crisis. And all of that is something to really focus on as you're building your teams. Remembering that going through difficult things has a positive impact. You don't want to lose all of those benefits. It's so easy. It's, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's human nature once a crisis is over to say, I'm going to put that in the closet. I'm going to close the door and lock it and forget it ever happened. And the reality is that the real growth comes from studying it. In terms of the people side of the equation, I really feel that is critical, and we're at that stage now. We're at that inflection point where it would be very easy to put the pandemic in the closet. As people begin to be vaccinated and we begin to be able to move forward. But taking that time to reflect is critical.
We're just about to come out of the pandemic, and we will all be pandemic veterans, and we will feel good about it. If we were to go 2 years from now and survey our organizations, we would find a significant percentage of the organization, because of turnover, would not be pandemic. And suddenly we would all assume that we all have this shared experience, and that percentage goes down and down as time passes. In armies, it's remarkably fast. And you can have two things happen there. First, you can have a bifurcation. The people who are veterans feel special, and the people who are not feel like they are not worthy. And so you've got to do things, as Kristen described, to keep building that teamwork. Use the lessons from it, but give everybody as much of that feeling and experience as you can, or you suddenly find yourself thinking that you have this great resiliency built in muscle memory, and it's far smaller than you hope it is.
We're very proud of our culture within the firm. We're very proud of how we connect with our people and the teaming that we have, right? Because we work in teams and we work together. We build that sort of shared cultural experience, shall we say. And when we're in a pandemic like this, because of the remote nature of our work, we start to lose that credit over time, right? And we've seen that sort of reserve run down over the past year. And it makes it very easy, or makes it easier for people to leave organizations, right? Because that shared experience has become a distant memory. And with turnover, you've got people who've never had a shared physical experience, right? A face-to-face team building or whatever it is, culture building experience. So for us, I mean, it's really, really important now that as we come out, we accelerate and we reconnect and we put even more importance on those sort of events and those sort of activities, because, as you say, you don't know when the next one is, and that's really resilience, isn't it? It's about building that up, building up the fuel tank, for want of a better word, or building up the credit so that when you go into the next one, you don't run them down too quickly. It's a real challenge now.
Ultimately, when you have a shared consciousness within an organization, that will also enable you to build trust upon, ultimately, and that will facilitate on how the rest of the organization will be responding, and then that will also lead up basically to a much more efficient but also a much more pleasant organization to be. And yes, absolutely, I think this is one of the cornerstones of resilience.
The idea of shared consciousness runs counter to sort of industrial age theory. And that was, you had very few smart people at the top who design the factory or the process, and then the workers execute a very defined set of best practices. And that's fine if things aren't constantly changing. If things are constantly changing, however, the workers down there are dealing with something that the brilliant people at the top couldn't have planned for or given them instructions for. What I found in the counterterrorist world is the only thing that worked was for me and the organization to be extraordinarily transparent. I had to sort of be humbly out there, say, here's what I know and don't know, and let the organization. And I thought it would undercut my authority, but it didn't. It actually reinforced it, because I became an enabler, not a director. It became pretty liberating, and I become convinced that's the only way to operate in a modern environment.
The reality is that, this new style of leadership that you've just described, Stan, wouldn't be possible without technology. I think that's one of the reasons, that the older style of leadership was so pervasive for so long, is, you had to have a small group who could be together to make decisions and then cascade it down. But technology has allowed new ways of leading, because you can connect, as we're doing now, right? With people, you can see them face to face, you can interact, and you can cascade messages much more quickly and accurately than you ever were able to do before. So there is absolutely a place, no question, for technology in crisis. I think we all agree. We've been talking a lot about people, and I think even earlier we said people are the most critical, and I do believe that's true. Again, because things are changing so rapidly, and because so much interpersonal connection is needed to lead through a crisis. But the reality is there are an enormous number of tools that we can all leverage to enhance our crisis response, from communication tools. There are tools in terms of project management and team management, right? To track who's doing what, who owns what issues, and where everyone can log in and see where certain issues stand, who has the ball, and what needs to happen next. And in terms of monitoring, of course, there's, threat management tools that utilize artificial intelligence and to scan the horizon and look for changes. All of these things are important and are part of your crisis response. I would add, however, that it is, again, human nature to want to buy a piece of software to solve a problem, right? To want to say, oh, I'll just go out and acquire that and it will handle everything for me. And I don't need the people and I don't need to practice and I don't need to think about it because I can just push a button and my crisis response will, software will take care of things for me. And, unfortunately, that doesn't exist. And so they all, people, processing, technology all need to work in tandem in order to effectively respond to a crisis and ultimately to emerge stronger.
Kristen, you've nailed that. And I would also add that we haven't figured it out yet. I haven't seen a single organization that's actually got the right combination of using. It's sort of an exploratory process, but I would say we just need to keep doing that.
Leadership is still really important in this situation, right? When I reflected on some of the comments at the beginning of my piece, we need to become more democratic as organizations. It's sort of an anathema to probably most of our traditional upbringing and so on. And I guess the key is it's not that we are, coming from a territory where we suffered 50 years of communism, right? In terms of how if you want to destroy anything of value, then you try and run it on that sort of basis, right? But I think it's much more around ensuring that we're communicating, we're getting the views of the people. It's not necessarily becoming, how would I say, slowed down or bogged down in minority views, but it's really understanding what the people in our organization need, responding to that, and then showing real leadership around that. And that's really the way I sort of legitimize this concept of it being more democratic and less command and control. It's of greater value for us making decisions when we understand all the moving parts. Yeah.
Don't put the pandemic in the closet. Do your own after-action assessment, as we did with our global crisis survey. Study what you did well, study what you didn't do well, and build in, there are silver linings for many companies that came out of the pandemic, innovations that popped up out of nowhere. Incorporate those into your business going forward. Take the time to do that. It may not feel natural, but that's how you emerge stronger. Get moving.
The pandemic is going to end soon. And if you're not already moving in the right direction, if you're not already been thinking about this and starting to implement, you're going to be too slow. If you wait 6 months from now, your competitors will have taken off and your people would have gotten really frustrated with you. So start pushing right now.
Keep communicating. Don't promise things that you're not sure you can deliver. We've done that before. It's been devastating. Be very clear about what you know and what you don't know. I mean, ask for input, but continue to make decisions and keep moving, as you say, Stan. That's really important. And then learn. I guess we learn and reflect on what's happening.